We're going to start now. I'm David Bonilla from the Institute of Economic Research. I'm based at the Urban and Regional Study Group here. And I've been working on energy issues and development, energy policy, transport policy and development. Well, welcome to our three speakers. First of all is Mr. Adugna, Professor Adugna Lemi, who is an associate professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts. Before Boston, Professor Lemi was an assistant professor at Winona State University in Minnesota. And he's been teaching courses on economic development, international trade, applied microeconomics, multinational corporations, and political economy. He's also been working in Africa, in Ethiopia, at the University of Addis Ababa, and the African Economic Research Consortium in Nairobi, Kenya, as a visiting professor and consultant. His research interests are economic development in Africa, capital flow and its determinants in developing countries, multinational corporations and their role in developing countries, as well as issues of poverty, trade, and income diversification in Ethiopia. Professor Lemi's works have been published in peer-reviewed academic journals, including the World Economy, Empirical Economics, the Eastern Economic Journal, International Trade Journal, Journal of Agricultural Economics, Transnational Corporations, African Finance Journal, Journal of Economic Development, etc., etc. Professor Lemi is currently working on a book titled Frontiers of the Last Frontier, Trade, Productivity, and Poverty in Africa. What have we learned from survey data? Our next speaker is Dr. Gázquez, who holds a PhD in international relations, who is just next to me, who was also a speaker yesterday at the sessions. And Dr. Gázquez has a PhD in African Studies from the Autonomous University of Madrid. And he holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in political and social studies from Sciences Po Institute of Political Studies in Paris, which is a very prestigious institution, actually, Sciences Po. He's done research on field work at the Institut Fondamental d'Afrique in Dakar, and he's also worked at the Gaston Berger University in Saint Louis, Senegal. He's a member of the working group of the University Program of Asian and African Studies under Dr. Hiron. And he's a coordinator of the Diploma in African Studies, Memory and Contemporary Dynamics. He's a member of the African Studies group at the Autonomous University of Madrid, and his research topics are Sufi Islam, African transnational networks and migrations, processes of state and identity formation, and construction of Sub-Saharan Africa and Senegal. He's currently a full-time associate professor researcher at the Center for International Relations of the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at UNAM, where he teaches the subject of Africa as part of the curriculum of the bachelor's degree in international relations. He's a member of the National System of Researchers as well. Our final speaker is Dr. Antonina Ivanova, sorry. She's a professor, researcher at the Economics Department and coordinator of the APEC Studies Center at the Autonomous University of Baja California Sur, a very nice region of Mexico, by the way. She's also a national researcher, level 2 of the CONACYT, of the Science and Technology Council. She's a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences, and she's represented Mexico at the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change within the framework of the United Nations. She's been a vice chair of Working Group 3 on the mitigation chapter from 2008 to 2016, which is, by the way, a very interesting chapter, the chapter on mitigation. I've read quite a few chapters of the IPCC myself, so I'm very interested in Dr. Ivanova. She's a graduate from the National Autonomous University from UNAM with a distinction, and she holds a postdoctoral degree in security and peace studies from the University of Bradford in the UK. She conducts research on international cooperation about climate action, tourism, and sustainable development. She has authored or edited 23 books and more than 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals. She's a lead author of the 4th and 6th IPCC assessment reports, an editor of the IPCC Special Report on Renewable Energy, in addition to 2 chapters in the Mexican Climate Change Report. In 2017, she received the Science and Technology Award and the Medal for Scientific and Technological Merit of the state of Baja California Sur. And in 2021, she was distinguished with the recognition of the University of Colima for her contribution to studies on the Pacific Basin. Among her recent publications, we can find the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, 3 Decades of History and Scenarios for the Future. So welcome to our 3 speakers. And I think we can start with Dr. Lemi, who presents the topic of strengthening South-South cooperation, the case of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Welcome to Dr. Lemi.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Hello? Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bonilla, for the introduction, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me to attend the colloquium. Particularly, I'd like to thank Dr. Harino and all the organizers, and Vanilla too, for helping me get here and for a nice reception here at in the campus. I also want to say, given that the UMass and UNAM collaboration is maybe relatively new, but we're hoping that the next colloquium will be in Boston, and I would like to see all of you in Boston in a couple of years, maybe in 2 years. So thank you. As Dr. Bonilla said, my topic today is to continue with what we started yesterday. We started yesterday about the South-South collaboration and how that helps Africa and how that helps in general the South to achieve the objectives they want to achieve. Here is the outline of my presentation. Just to make sure everybody is on the same page, I want to put some profile of the African countries, the economic profile rather, and then followed by what are the trading partners of African countries, to shed light to who are the major partners, who are the key role players in the continent. And then the example I use as a South-South collaboration is a new continental free trade area, what they call the FCAF, the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'll talk a little bit about the objectives, the implementation phases, and the potential gains and impacts, followed by the challenges. I have a couple of slides about climate change, but I will rather defer that to Dr. Ivanova, who is more qualified in that area. But I will touch a little bit about on how the African Continental Free Trade Area if there is any say in the agreement about the climate change, what they plan to do in terms of mitigating climate change in African context. To give you an idea, yesterday we talked about, Oscar was giving us an idea about agency is very important for any continent to be represented. For African countries, so far, the claim is there is no agency, there is no representation, there is no voice in any front. But I was trying to show you what is the cause of that lack of agency. If you see this chart shows percentage share in the world, African countries in terms of trade. There's only 2.1% total trade share in the world, which means total import and export when compared to the total world volume of trade. GDP size, only 2.9% of the total world GDP. So you can imagine from the economic side, from the economic perspective, the African potential, the bargaining power is not there. But I think it's Dr. Hiron yesterday mentioned about the potential in the future in terms of the population, the youth in African countries. If you see the population size of Africa compared to the world, it is 16.7%. So there is where the potential lies. But you cannot claim just by saying I have 1 billion, 1.3 billion, therefore I have to have a say. You have to show economically that you have bargaining power. So the idea of this cross-continental free trade area is to increase the trade participation, the GDP share of African countries in the world stage. So this is the attempt by African countries to bring this. For those of you not familiar, just to give you an idea of the sub-Saharan African countries in terms of GDP per capita, it's only 3,200 something. You can compare that to Mexico, for example, the GDP per capita is about $10,000, which is African countries as a whole is way behind. But the one potential they have is the growth is there. 5.8% growth of your GDP is a big deal. But since the base is very small, it's not that much yet. If you see the informal employment in both the sub-Saharan Africa and North African countries, that's where the potential lies. About 70% in African countries are in the informal sector. So the potential is to move these people in the informal sector into the formal sector and make it count. Right now, it's not counting. So you're not counting 70% of your workforce in your total GDP. So there is middle class. It's not poverty rate, as you can see, it is very high. It's declining, but it's not really a bright spot in the context of African countries. I don't know if you can see this, but this is what I showed you about real GDP growth in recent years, 2018. Most countries are growing in a positive rate. Probably Libya is one of the countries that grow fast. It is natural resource, it is oil. But nevertheless, all the countries, almost all the countries are growing in recent years, a positive territory. But if you see their current account balance, it's only a few countries who can claim a positive trade surplus. Almost all of them are negative, if you can see, which is the experience of almost all developing countries. The biggest economies in Africa, as you can see, South Africa used to dominate until 2005, then taken over by Nigeria, and then followed by Egypt, South Africa, Algeria, and Ethiopia. For some reason, that's I can brag about that. That's where I came from. Ethiopia all of a sudden showed up as number 5 or number 6 on the GDP size. You can imagine all these changes are because of economic progress in some of these countries. The only country consistently on number 5 is Morocco. Everybody else has been changing spots. Okay. Which are the countries with the positive or GDP per capita, which is very close to what we call to say Asian countries or some Latin American countries. It is the top north and the southern countries in Africa. The middle is just like a vacuum. There is nothing almost going on. Maybe the GDP per capita is 1,000 or less than 1,000. I can give you an example of the Ethiopian GDP per capita was only recently reached $1,000 per year. But North African countries, because of oil, Southern African countries, maybe because of minerals, their GDP per capita is higher. Who are the trading partners? There is big shift here too, as you can imagine, between 2000 and 2019. So you can guess why the 2019 showed up as almost all red. It is a Chinese color. Because China joined WTO in 2001. Right after joining WTO, China dominated the world as the factory of the world. So in 2019, most of the trading partner for 3/4 of African countries became China, replacing the former colonies of Europe. US is not even a major player here, replacing even South Africa by itself as one of the trading partner for other African countries. But as you can see, there is a shift. So as this shifts, African countries trying to write their own history by claiming, okay, wait a minute, there is this much shift, what did we get? How can we make sure that we benefit from this movement around the world? This is the same thing about trading partners. I don't want to spend on here. But one other structure of GDP, as you can see, this is a share of the GDP. I showed you this earlier as well, so I'll skip this slide. What's the structure of the GDP in African countries? What do they produce most? So this is a major change. I'm not sure if I get the same number from Latin American countries or from Mexico, but in African countries, the past 10 years was a movement from agriculture to the service sector. So service sector is becoming like 50% of the GDP share. It used to be agriculture. So all the countries are abandoning agriculture, moving into the service sector. What are these service sectors? The service sectors are not IT, they are not banking, they are not insurance. They are wholesale trade, retail trade, this kind of services, which may create jobs, but is not something that you can rely on. And one of, I don't know if most of you know about Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who won Nobel Prize. He went to African countries recently, and they asked him, look, we cannot compete with China. China is taking over all the manufacturing. What do we do? He suggested, okay, you guys focus on the service sector. And what service sector? We don't have the technologies and know-how to cover. But he told them within the service sector, the only bet you have is on the tourism sector. Tourism may be your best bet. You cannot compete, at least for now, you cannot compete for manufacturing. So this is a little bit profile African countries. Now I move to what is the Continental Free Trade area and what they plan to do. Here is the objective of the free trade area. Probably most of you know from reading the NAFTA, reading Mercosur, reading the Central Africa Trade Agreement. You can read, the objectives are pretty straightforward. So we want to make more trade among ourselves. We want to encourage free mobility of people and capital. And we want to promote industrial development. We don't have to buy everything from China or from Europe or from America. We can make it ourselves, right? And the Pan-African idea is, why can't we trade among ourselves, right? If we need this product, why can't we buy from South Africa? So overall, the objective is, let's look for South-South collaboration. Let's trade among ourselves to increase our GDP. And on our way, we can solve our trade deficit issues. Here are some of the benefits that we expect from these objectives. It's all hypothetical at this point, because this started probably a year or 2 years ago. These are all hypothetical. Companies can trade more, you can cut costs, so you don't have to buy products from China, you can cut transportation costs, insurance costs. These are all nice promises that they make to the business community. If you engage in cross-country, intra-Africa trade, this is what you benefit. I'll skip this one to this is the establishment. The idea started in 2012 in Addis Ababa. Probably some of the ideas started even earlier, but this is a formal way of a decision to make this a fast-track process to establish the African Free Trade Area. But actually, it is January 2021 is when actually they start trading under free trade. In South Africa, they start trading cross-border using this free trade agreement. And in February of last year, the African Export-Import Bank, they created this adjustment fund. Adjustment fund is anything happens between these countries because they implemented the free trade area, they can get some compensation through this fund. So right now it has about $10 billion in its account. So countries can apply by saying, okay, look, I have this problem because I can't implement the free trade area. So can I get money? Or I cut tariff and then I lost tariff revenue. Can I get compensation from this fund? That's the purpose of this fund. And I don't know if 10 billion is enough. I know a lot of countries will complain about losing tariff revenue because of this. But here are the phases of the implementation of the free trade area. Right now, we are only in phase 1. That's trade in goods, trade and services, and dispute settlement mechanism. In the future, there is a plan to open this for intellectual property, for investment, for competition, and in phase 3, hopefully digital trade. When you buy goods from other country digitally, maybe there is some way of controlling that or managing that or collecting tariff on that. On women, on use in trade, that's phase 3. Okay, what are the potential of this continent and what is expectation in 2030? So our reference point in this study always is 2030 because the World Bank and the IMF did analysis to show here is what you get if you implement the free trade area, right? This is all projections. Some countries may not agree with that until they see it. But if you go by the projection, by 2030, what you get is you almost double your intra-Africa trade. The people will be 1.7 billion, and the economy will grow to 6.7, almost double. So this is a very ambitious projection. I don't know if this will be realized. I'll talk to you about the challenges of the African Free Trade Area. If they solve all the challenges, maybe you can attain this. And this achievement in like less than 10 years is a big accomplishment if it happens. But I'll come back to the challenges to tell. This is again another way of showing this is by UNCTAD. They show, okay, look, if you implement it, this is what you get. Your employment will grow by this much. Your GDP will grow by this much. Your welfare gain, one of the important areas, is $16.1 billion welfare gain for the people of Africa. Intra-Africa trade grow by 33%. Trade deficit, see the last circle there, trade deficit reduces by 50%. This is one of the headaches of a lot of African countries. There is trade deficit because they always buy from Europe for very essential input, for medication. From China now, even to the level of t-shirts and shoes, they buy from China. So there is a big trade deficit. If this happens and trade deficit goes down by 50%, this is a big accomplishment. There's also this projection to gain for countries, real income gain, if you implement this, if you implement that. For all the countries, the red line is if you implement reduction in tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and tariff effects, you'll get increase in your real income over time. This again by 2030. Same thing here, share of intra-Africa trade within African countries, trade will increase if they implement the free trade area. Again, this is all projection. Wage for skilled workers, North African countries increased to 0.92. West African countries, maybe no change as much. East African countries, maybe change only for unskilled workers and so forth. Now, the big issue I want to talk to you is to achieve all these projections by 2030, we have to see what are the challenges that African countries face in terms of trade. So I categorize them into about 7 or 6 groups. The first one is infrastructure. One example they give even at the meetings of the free trade area is to export anything from Kenya to Nigeria, you have to go through Asia. There is no railways, there is no road connecting Kenya to Nigeria. So you cannot expect to increase trade. Why do you want to go through China and then send it to Mexico or send it to Nigeria instead of just buy from China? That's easier, that's shorter. Right? So that's one challenge. And loss of revenue, I told you about, I'll talk about that. Currency convertibility. Right now, there is no strong currency in a lot of African countries, except some countries in North Africa and South Africa, particularly, maybe a little bit stronger, but other countries, not that much. Other major challenges, African countries trade similar goods, so they don't want to buy coffee for coffee. For example, Ethiopia and Kenya, known in coffee and tea export. So it's difficult for them, thank you, for them to trade. How large is the intra-Africa trade, overlapping regional agreement, and limited adjustment funds? So I'll just briefly show you some statistics to verify that these challenges are there. Infrastructure, for example. Oops. Infrastructure, for example, as I told you, these are the road networks in Africa. Some of them not complete yet. The dots are really, you cannot rely on that to trade. If you see, for example, as I told you about between Ethiopia and the West, or between Kenya and the West, there is no really reliable road or rail network. So that's a big challenge, which takes time to build this. So it's not something you say, okay, let me ship my stuff to Cameroon or something, right? So that's one challenge. Again, this is another one from the Economist, which shows basically you can see the gap between the East and the West. They're not connected. Overlapping regional trade agreements, that's another challenge. So African countries, for some reason, I don't know, maybe it is true for Latin American too, they have what they call the spaghetti bowl of regional trade agreements. So these countries are all a member of several regional trade agreements. You impose on this the continental free trade area. What do you do with this regional trade agreement? You eliminate them? What do you do? So I was talking, I think yesterday with Fanny about the NAFTA, and then now Mexico has another agreement with Japan and Korea. How do you solve that? Are you trying to trick the NAFTA system through another way, or how do you overcome that? So there is this challenge. Countries in this group, they don't want to eliminate this, but this is a challenge currently. I don't think they address that in a proper way. African countries trade similar goods. They trade similar goods means why you want to trade if you have coffee or if you have tea. Similar goods. For example, these are the commodity dependent. They export similar commodities, these countries. Copper, gold, diamond, Eastern African countries, coffee, tea, it's similar. It takes time for them to figure out, okay, what does Kenya need? Can I make it here instead of coffee, right? So this overlapping or similar products, every country is dominated by one or two commodities as their major export item. It's difficult for them to trade at this stage. That's why in African countries right now, their cross-country or intra-regional trade is only 15%. So one country buys from other African country only for 15% of its trade. Everything else comes from another country. Currency convertibility. Most countries, they want to trade still in dollars. So you defeat the point of saving your budget, your trade deficit, if you still rely on dollar as your medium of exchange. So there is a discussion about let's use our own currency instead of US dollars or euro, but that never happened yet. So we'll see if that happens. These are the different currencies, different phases, different colors. For each African country, they have their own. The only exception was in Zimbabwe a couple of years ago, they resorted to using US dollars as their currency. That's the only country which like trying to say, okay, forget currency, I'll use dollar. Every other country, they have their own currency. So it's challenging to transact in this environment. These are their currency and how much it is appreciated, how much it's depreciated. Let me talk about loss of revenue. the agreement puts that 90% of your tariffs, your commodity tariffs, must be reduced to zero by different years, like five, depending on your level of development, in 5, 15, in 10 years, in 15 years. Losing this much revenue is a challenge for African countries. You have to cut your tariff, 90% of your trade with African countries, you have to cut to zero. That's a big tariff revenue loss. This is how much each country imports from each other. How much you import from, for example, Cameroon, how much it imports from other African countries. Cameroon is number 1, followed by Ethiopia. So losing this tariff revenue will be a challenge for them. So I'll rush through. And finally, the African Adjustment Fund. It is good to have an adjustment fund to rely on if something happens, but the amount they have right now is 10 million for 54 countries. Tariff. They just signed this agreement in March, the adjustment fund. It's a guarantee for some countries. Okay, I lose money, what do I get? The complaint is that there is not enough money. The complaint is that the process is not clear how to get this fund if there is a loss of revenue. So I already mentioned this. Let me touch a little bit finally about the impact on climate change. The first thing we have to notice is African countries are the most affected by the impact, but the least contributors to the climate change. Right? You can see here areas becoming drier and drier. The yellow and the red areas are the areas becoming drier in a couple of years. This is by how much they lose productivity. The darker red color is how much productivity declines because of climate change. The orange color is, again, the decline in productivity by up to 25%, up to 50%. So they are affected by the climate change. But what does the African Continental Free Trade Area say about climate change? Nothing. They did not mention anything about climate. Their objective is right now to increase trade among African countries. They did not mention anything about what to do, how to produce sustainably, how to produce, how to protect the climate, or how to improve adaptation. I'll conclude by saying the size of African economies is relatively small, but there is a potential for growth. The Continental Free Trade Area is one way to realize this potential and to build your bargaining power so that when you go to the world stage, you negotiate as a group, as a continent, not as one country. African countries therefore create a bigger market to help them to have a say on the global stage. So there are some challenges. From my perspective, some of those challenges are big. You cannot overcome it overnight. Infrastructure, you cannot overcome it over time. So this potential cannot be realized in the next 5 years, for example. It has to be next 10 years. It has to be next 15 years if you really want to make any potential change. Second, the climate change, given the topic of today's discussion is climate change, they have to convince African countries to produce sustainably, to make sure that the production process is not just to compete with China, because China is doing all the different kind of ways producing just cheap product. But if you are trading among yourselves, make sure you have a code, make sure you have an agreement, make sure you have a standard to have a sustainable production to preserve the environment. I think I'll stop there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Well, good morning to everybody. I'm very happy to be again with you in this colloquium. Thanks for the organization once again to PUEA and to the Institute for hosting this event. I'm going to read most of my presentation because it's in English, and if I don't do it like that, I will not cover all the points that I want to speak. In the first part of this presentation, my goal is to present how the impact, and continue in the Adugna's presentation, how the impact of climate change is more acutely felt in African states and societies than elsewhere because of several factors. The most important one for me are the consequence of a development model determined by the global neoliberal capitalist economic system and ideology that has been imposed on Africa by Western powers since its early mercantilist stages. I think the current scenario of a multidimensional crisis poses African countries crucial challenges, such as balancing access to energy and therefore promoting economic growth, and achieving at the same time climate protection in a continent where, as we have been seeing, has the largest energy gap globally. So while there is evidently no time for me to review the many ways in which the impact of colonialism is still being exerted, felt, and reproduced through neocolonial means in African societies, I will just mention the two that seem to me the most evident of all. First, the incorporation and fragmentation of African territories into Western colonial empires, and afterwards into post-colonial nation states. And two, and related to the other factor I mentioned, is the forced integration of those territories to the global capitalist system. As I'm going to show, Africa continues to suffer more than any other region in the world of the triple impact produced by slave trade that lasted at least 2 centuries, and afterwards because of the imposition of capitalism and the nation-state system. I think there are the two most obvious legacies of colonialism, but that nevertheless are the ones that still determine in great measure the current, the present of African societies and states. So due to these big historical processes going on since the first colonial encounters between European and African societies, during the post-colonial period, African contemporary states display a series of common negative traits that make them particularly vulnerable to the current context of climate change, exacerbated at this juncture also by the coronavirus pandemics. Which is the specific impact of climate change in Africa? Well, Africa is the most vulnerable region to climate change, but as Adugna has said, is the least able to respond to it. As some studies point out, for progress to be made, global climate solutions must address Africa's specific vulnerabilities. Being the less industrialized continent, and thus having contributed the least to climate change, Africa is nevertheless paying the highest prices. For example, phenomena associated to global warming, like the disruption on the average precipitation levels, is also felt in other regions of the world, but nonetheless, in Africa is more severely affected by it, since the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change are in the continent. And it is also forecasted that the climate change can push in the next years some 40 million people to poverty, and can produce displacement of approximately another 85 million. It would be a very bad situation if the African continent already very hit by poverty. I mean, there are like 600 million poor people in Africa. If there are additional number of poor people pushed into this condition by climate change. So what is, I think that everybody knows what is climate change, but very broadly, the concept refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns globally. And the impact of these long-term shifts is measured by an augmentation of extreme weather events on the one hand, and slow onset effects on the other. It has been argued that industrialization taking place in Europe and North America since the 19th century has produced most of the greenhouse gases that are highly responsible for climate change in the world. With historically low carbon emissions, Africa has contributed very little to climate change, with South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria being responsible of approximately 51% of the African emissions. So we can see that even at this small number of emissions are produced only mainly by 3 countries. Nevertheless, temperatures in Africa, like Adugna was showing, rise faster than everywhere, and precipitations become more and more unpredictable as extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, landslides, or storms increase their frequency. As for the slow onset effects, the effects that constitute the gradual effects of the long-term shifts in temperature, such as desertification, rising sea levels, land degradation, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, glacial retreat, or salinization, it should be said that all of them are present in Africa. There is already evidence that in several African countries there are shrinking crop yields caused by climate change. Suffering from year-long droughts in 2021, Madagascar was the first country in the world to face a famine solely due to the consequences of climate change. So afterwards, I will also like to ask Gabrielle how this policy of the government that she was analyzing yesterday was compounded with this famine going on at the same time. No? Well, it's a question I have for her. Associated with this, we know that food prices have been rising since food prices have been rising globally because of the combined effects of the lockdown policies during the COVID-19 pandemic, and more recently by the conflict in Ukraine. Food prices reached an all-time high in March 2022, and this is problematic for specifically for Africa, because inflation rates that were already high worldwide were specifically high in Africa. We can see this comparing the 3.6% of inflation rate globally compared to 9.8% as an average in African countries. So rising food prices are expected to be the largest exacerbating factor of climate change and poverty in Africa. For these reasons, among others, fighting climate change at global levels requires addressing Africa's specific development challenges. For instance, in the framework of the Agenda 2030, climate change and COVID-19 are putting at risk the achievement of the continent in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. 12 out of 17 Sustainable Development Goals involve taking direct action on climate change, and especially Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which refers specifically to climate action, to take action against climate change. So we can see that there is a kind of vicious circle going on in which African societies and countries most severely affected by climate change, where poverty rates are already high, where there is a low access to education, deficient health capacities, and high unemployment rates, among others, provoke a low capacity of resilience by societies that are in turn progressively less able to face environmental challenges. Even under these circumstances, 3/4 of African countries have achieved Sustainable Development Goal number 13 on climate action, while no European Union country nor the US or Canada has done so. Almost 90% of the European Union and North America countries are facing major challenges in achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 13, and none are on the track for its achievement. To all this, it should be added that the negative spillover effects have from already industrialized countries, such as the embodied imports of greenhouse gases, the buying of carbon credits, land degradation, or water scarcity, all resulting from Western or other capitalist powers' exploitation of the continent, and they pose additional obstacles to Africa's development under climate change crisis conditions. Africa may be absent, and this is what we were trying to discuss yesterday, may be absent from mainstream theoretical discussions within the field of international relations, but we can see that is at the core of multiple global issues. One of the most important, if not the most important, is climate change. So recognizing this means that we have to address the question of how to achieve development in Africa under climate change conditions, and try to answer this question through the envisioning of major reforms to the capitalist system, or in a more radical vein, through its dissolution. Either way must take into account a shift in the way we conceive and represent Africa and its place in the world, both in academic and political circles and contexts. So while Africa is at the forefront of achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 13, it is at the same time, it's critically lagging behind other Sustainable Development Goals, such as Sustainable Development Goal 1, poverty, or number 2, hunger, and especially for the aim of this presentation, Sustainable Development Goal number 7, related to energy. The achievement of this last Sustainable Development Goal is highly problematical in Africa because it poses the challenge of reconciling energy justice, which is part of development justice, with climate justice. Realizing Africa's development agenda depends on addressing the continent's energy gap with the rest of the world. Yesterday, Dr. Giron was already telling us that 600 million people in Africa still lack access to electricity, and 930 million people lack access to clean cooking fuels. Africa is the continent with the lowest rates of access to energy globally, and this is problematic also because of African demographics. We must remember that the African population is expected to almost double by 2050 and to increase threefold by 2100. Yet, policies focused on ending fossil fuel financing, which is basically the position of northern countries in climate change negotiations, risk kicking away the development ladder for Africa. Africa hosts an enormous potential in the domain of renewable energies, but alone at this juncture, it would be insufficient to satisfy with this kind of energies the continental growing energy demand. For example, projects such as the African Integrated High-Speed Rail Network that is supposed to cover transcontinental distances from Casablanca to Cairo and to Cape Town, the dream of Cecil Rhodes, or the Trans-African Highway Network Program that Adugna already talked about us, are central for the African Continental Free Trade Area integration process. And these projects will certainly increase more the demand of energy. So to answer the question of how to merge climate and development goals in Africa, it has been put forward that the exploitation of natural gas as a transition fuel towards a future dominated by renewables might be a transition solution. Natural gas should be seen as an African option because of its abundance and because it is the cleanest burning fossil fuel compared to coal, wood, or oil. Wood produces even more carbon dioxide emissions than coal or oil. And in sub-Saharan Africa, around 70% of households depend on wood fuel for energy. Besides the terrible effects on health that the use of wood has for cooking, it is also contributing to deforestation in the Congo Basin, considered to be the second lung of the planet after the Amazonian jungle. Finally, another question around the issue of gas as a major transitional development driver would be how to ensure that African gas can primarily serve African people, and address the energy gap in its countries, and not serve the growing extractive interests of Western and other powers participating in the new scramble for Africa. In second place of this communication, I would like to reflect on how African countries, if certain conditions are satisfied, could play a central role in the global fight against climate change. We have seen also that Africa holds ecological and mineral assets that are key for the world. It is home of almost 1/4 of the world's biodiversity hotspots and 30% of world's mineral reserves, which could be critical to a future determined by the use of renewable sources of energy and low carbon technologies. Nevertheless, Sub-Saharan Africa receives just 5% of the total climate finance and must in turn pay for adaptation measures. In Ethiopia, it is estimated that adaptation measures until 2030 are expected to have a cost of 6 billion every year, which is equal to 5.6% of its current GDP. And Sierra Leone, for example, at least 40% of its international development funds will need to be channeled through adaptation measures that cannot be, and this money cannot be spent otherwise. It is also important to highlight the role of the African Union and African climate negotiators in boosting the issue of climate change impact in the agendas of multilateral organizations and forums. For example, in the last COP27 that was held in Africa, by the way, and that was dubbed by some as the African COP, a facility on loss and damage was approved. We should not underestimate the importance of it because it constitutes a recognition that the most vulnerable countries will require urgent financing to address the immediacy of the climate crisis. While the establishment of the fund is a victory, the fact is that resources are not going to flow immediately. There is still a huge debate about how it will be funded and who will pay into that fund. And these issues are fundamental to an effective operational modality that will allow funding to flow to those who need it the most. We have seen floods, great floods in Nigeria and also in elsewhere, in Pakistan, for example. We have seen droughts in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. All these issues are costing lives and property, and there is no mechanism at present to quickly provide resources to address the reality of the climate crisis for the most vulnerable. So Africa has shown ambition in terms of where it wants to act, but doesn't have the resources to do it. Likewise, this context also allows the African states, societies, and organizations. This context presents an opportunity to overcome historical divisions between them and finding the fact that Africa is the most severely affected continent by the climate change, while the less responsible for it are rallying political point that could increase the political weight of the continent globally. It should be added that the large-scale armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine has also revived political negotiation space for the demand of external resources as well as its supply. It has also had the effect of allowing African countries to choose their positions regarding the conflict as a result of international and transnational and geopolitical connections. The main argument here is that an increased interaction and cooperation frameworks between countries of the so-called Global South facing similar challenges related to climate change could be highly beneficial in both tangible and intangible dimensions of the emergent South-South cooperation model. Yesterday, we were already talking about this rise and fall of South-South cooperation during the second half of the 20th century and how it has been revived in the last decade. And we were also having a discussion of how we should problematize this South-South cooperation model because I would like to in the final part of this presentation, I would like to conclude on the need to foster research, teaching, and learning of international relations from the perspective of the Global South, as opposed to the conventional Eurocentric Western paradigm. In the Global South paradigm, Africa, with its cultural specificities and understood from its own historical perspectives, is a critical actor, a major actor of international relations, together with other regions and states that constitute the post-colonial space of the international system. In the Global South paradigm, Africa is a place where different globalizing hegemonic projects are at play and local societies are at risk. In the Global South paradigm, also African knowledge production systems are given paramount importance in the conception of human and international relations, and so on. We can still further the discussion about how to conceptualize international relations from the Global South, but what I would like to underscore is that since I'm not a development economics expert nor a climate change expert, I do most, what I do most is African studies. I teach Africa. But what my interest is not in the African situation by itself. I'm interested in the conceptual dimension of the concept of Africa. So even the fact that we talk about Africa as a continent, I would like to cite the work of a dear colleague here in Mexico, Marco Reyes, an Africanist, also what he calls the continentalization of Africa is part of the representational process of its marginalization, both in research and in political and economic relations. To illustrate this last point, I would like to recall an episode of the BBC documentary series by the late Kenyan philosopher Ali Masri about the triple cultural heritage of Africa, the Christian heritage, the Muslim, and the African heritage. For him, this continentalization of Africa begins with a cataclysm that took place some 5 or more million years ago that created the Rift Valley in Kenya and provoked the separation of the Arabic Peninsula from the landmass of today Africa. So he argues that the idea of Africa was born out of the evolution of the capitalist system that required the construction of the Suez Canal in order to promote a worldview, an order based on international maritime trade of manufactured products in exchange of raw materials from the colonies. European power, its geopolitical perspective and its preeminence, for example, in map making, decided the limits of Africa and not the would-be bridges and tunnels that would have been constructed in order to cross the peninsula and connect culturally similar populations. It was this geopolitical vision, finally, that promoted the construction of the canal, in which, by the way, hundreds of thousands of Egyptians lost their lives during its construction. So I think that the main task we have as scholars is, as the title of the colloquium states, to move Africa to the center of the analysis. We already talked that it should not be seen as the center of the world, but I think it should be pushed to the center of the analysis and theory construction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gázquez. It was an interesting talk on climate impacts and how Africa is struggling to mitigate the emissions. I think our next speaker is Dr. Ivanova, and the title of her presentation is South-South Cooperation and Low Carbon Growth in Africa, the Belt and Road Initiative of China, which is also a very interesting perspective on the Chinese role on Africa. Okay. Thank you. You've got half an hour, actually. It's not 20 minutes. You've got half an hour.
Nobody told me, but I can make it. Okay. Here I would like to thank the presentation of Dr. Bonilla, the invitation of Dr. Giron, and also the speakers that preceded me and gave some background on the situation of Africa. As it was stated in my bio sketch, I am not specialist precisely in Africa. I am studying the Pacific Rim and the APEC. So my interest in Africa in this sense is to see how the Chinese initiative of the Belt and Road is impacting on Africa. The presentation topics are South-South Cooperation and Belt and Road Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative and Africa, and also we will try to interpret the initiative and assess some risks of this initiative that are accompanying the benefits of this Belt and Road Initiative. So we will resume in brief in the beginning the principles of South-South cooperation. The South-South cooperation began in the 60s, but now it is expanding its scope because there is more South countries that are in higher development level than other developing countries, and some technologies are more apt to be used in some developing countries if they were developed in other developing countries, for example, as biofuels and some other technology progresses that are, for example, very usual for more climate climates. Here we must have, in first place, mutual gain and non-interference. It must be demand driven. Differentiating it from, for example, North-South cooperation, it must not be put some conditions on the political development of the country. For example, it must not be demanded that democracy should be forcibly implemented in the country. There must be created the collective growth opportunities and the self-reliance of the countries. The country must grow out self-reliant as the consequence of the South-South cooperation and not be depending on the cooperation partner, as it often was the result of the North-South cooperation. I mentioned the absence of conditionalities. Also, we will see later that some kinds of the Chinese South-South cooperation impose some conditionalities on the countries. And the modalities of the South-South cooperation must be the capacity building. The host countries must not depend on the specialists imported from the financing country, but they must build their own capacity that could attend the new technologies and the new objects, infrastructure objects, for example, constructed in that country. The technology must be transferred in equal conditions and accessible for the host country. Here we have also South-South cooperation in trade, as we saw in Dr. Lemi's presentation. In the financing, it is very important, the concessional finance and also the grants. This South-South cooperation is very important to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal number 70, that is stating that the cooperation on international level is very important for achieving all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So it is a decisive part of this cooperation. So what can we say about the BRI initiative? It was announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 1913. It is also called One Belt, One Road, and it is an initiative that want to involve many countries, in first place developing countries, and projects in trade, in infrastructure and lending. And thus will be involved with China, many economies in Asia, Europe, Africa, and Oceania. So the Chinese government aims to develop, in first place, connectivity and economic cooperation over land, that is the belt, and over sea, that is the road between China, the rest of Eurasia, and Africa. Many times it is stated, as we will see, that this initiative is also very related to the proper Chinese interests, that China is building these infrastructure objects to secure the transport of the national resources to its proper economy for the development. So some academicians inclusively speak about the new imperialism in this sense of China. In this Belt and Road Initiative, there are included some developed countries, for example, Italy, for example, the Netherlands. So China is making huge investments and also buying some ports in developed countries to secure this transportation of specific and needed for her, for its economy, natural resources and commodities. So we can see that the Silk and Road initiative, it is based on the initial Silk Road of the 13th, 14th century of China. Here it is very important that in the African continent, the East Africa, and its countries along the Nile represent the initial Silk Road of China, which was the basis of the construction of BRI initiative. And it is led by countries with key ports, including Kenya, Djibouti, now also Morocco, that is not the formal part of Belt and Road Initiative, is receiving financing for its ports. And it is crucial for African trade with Europe, Latin America, Caribbean, and North America. And this stage after the COVID-19 and the recuperation that is demanding huge resources in the regions connected closely to China, these stages of Latin America and North America are not the priority for China. It is concentrating in the Asia countries, in the Caucasic republics, but also in Africa because of its huge importance for the natural resources and also the infrastructure that is connecting with the strategic points of the earth. And the Chinese investment activity in the pre-COVID period was centered in the West African countries to build the ports, very important for the connectivity of China. Here we can see in this map precisely the belt that is with red, And the roads that are the maritime roads, these maritime roads are expanded in the last years. So we can see in this map also why it is very important. The colleagues that preceded me spoke about the highly vulnerability of Africa to the climate change. But here we can see in this map that more than 50 countries are highly exposed to climate change. And 22 of the 28 countries extremely vulnerable to climate change on world level are in Africa. And this is from the last assessment report of the IPCC. So the vulnerability is very high. The historical responsibility of Africa is very low because in the 1800, the countries that began to develop and contributed to the accumulation of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were beginning from England, some other European countries like France, like Germany, then the United States, and so on. It is very important also to state that 5 years ago, China was in the first place. It was after the United States 5 years ago, but now it is in the first place as emitter of greenhouse gases. So the Chinese initiative to contribute to the diminish the greenhouse gases emissions on world level is very important. It is worth to mention that till the 2010, China was leading a group of developing countries that are stressing on the historical responsibility of the developed countries and were saying that the developing countries must not contribute to the mitigation of climate change, that is diminishing the greenhouse gas emissions, but only dedicate the financial resources to the adaptation, to affronting the damage provoked by the climate change. But after the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, it was stated with high participation of Chinese researchers also, that China was one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate change. So the discourse of China changed. Yes, we must contribute to the mitigation, but with the decisive aid by the developed countries because of their historical responsibility. So we will mitigate, but our mitigation responsibilities will be linked to the aid from the developed countries. So the nationally determined contributions of all the developing countries within the Paris Agreement are linked to the aid of the developed countries. And here we'll see how the Chinese investment is linked to many African countries. We have the ports in blue that are involved in financing construction and operation by Chinese capitals. We have also the white blue, these are ports that are now constructed with Chinese investment. Also, we have the planned railways that are relying to Chinese finance resources. And also we have in red the countries that have formal contracts with Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank that is financed in first place by China, and also the prospective members and light red of the Asia Reconstruction and Development Bank. Also, we have very ports, new ports planned as a Belt Initiative of China in Africa, and both East and West of Africa. So we have also the 83 billion from China to Africa. Here I will not speak about each country, but we can see that we have affluence of the Chinese capital to countries that are not yet formal members of BRI initiative, but are prospective members. So these prospective members are receiving Chinese financing in huge amounts, and in this sense, they become linked to Chinese economy. And in this new era of cooperation, we can say that there is enough empirical evidence to state that in fact BRI channels substantial gains for African countries. There are some gains in education, communication, agriculture, but above all, they are concentrated in infrastructure. And here China is aiming to build infrastructure that is low carbon infrastructure, because the most of the emissions of greenhouse gases in world level is from the infrastructure objects. So in this sense, it is analyzed that the developing countries have more possibility to build low carbon infrastructure than the developed countries that have big amounts of infrastructure that is highly emitting of GHG. So the developing countries in the new infrastructure by once can aim to have low carbon infrastructure. But there are also many debates and controversies in this investment of China. The Western countries are criticizing this investment because China is supporting with this investment also some governments that are dictatorial, that are not respecting the human rights and so on. There are no political conditions, and yet it is one political conditions. Africa doesn't, China doesn't support African countries that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. So it is also a political condition. But not only the Western countries, but many academicians, members of society, NGOs, etc., in the African countries find that these projects are very oriented to the Chinese interest and doesn't support the interest of the African countries, because they don't diminish the poverty, don't help the most vulnerable groups. But the infrastructure is tied to the Green Investment Principles Network that is promoted by the United Kingdoms, and they are participating many countries. China is building its infrastructure policy on these investment principles. And this includes sustainability into corporate governments, understand environmental, social, governance risk, the disclosure of environmental information. It is not always made. Improve communication with stakeholders to take also the interests of the stakeholders, including the community groups. It is not always made. And use green financial instruments. It is in majority of the cases, yes, accomplished. Promote green management of supply chains. Here we have some exceptions, but China in the last years, when United States abandoned the Paris Agreement with the President Trump, the President Xi Jinping wanted to have the climate leadership in the world. So they began to advance in this climate change action, mitigation and adaptation. For example, China now is the #1 producer of solar panels in the world. No? So they're promoting these green supply chains and the microchips, you know, all this about microchips, that Taiwan is in the first place, but China has huge participants. So now in the controversies between the United States and China, United States prohibited all the American companies to export microchips technology to China, inclusively Americans who work with Chinese in the microchips production are in the possibility to lose the American citizenships. So they are very strong measures, and the capacity building through collective actions. That we also stated that China is not building local capacity by the time. It is highly criticized. And according to the African Development Bank, the continent needs 130 to 170 billion USD for the new infrastructure annually. And as already stated by previous speakers, the Green Development Fund is not functioning now, and it is functioning not so good because of the COVID problems, the recovery, and some problems that the developed countries got because of the Russia-Ukraine war and so on. And African countries may get non-Chinese loans, but this average a lengthy 9 years to get approved to high scrutiny, because it's make always the environmental assessment report. And the Chinese loans purely look at the viability of the project, and the decisions are made very quickly, 2 years. So compare 2 years to 7 years. And the Chinese finance in Africa in pre-COVID period from 2003 to 2019 is 82 billion USD, and about half are commodity secured. This is the other side, that it is secured by the commodities of the developing African countries. So it must create a dependence of these countries by China. So we always criticize the dependence of the African countries from the United States, but we must take into account that a new dependence should not be created. It is not helping to the African countries to substitute this dependence from the US or some European countries by the dependence from China. No? And the Chinese financing is also tied to Chinese suppliers. Here, Dr. Lemi told us as the trade between China and Africa growth in the last years. So this is many times due precisely to the financing by China that is tied to the supply from China of many goods, including t-shirts, as the colleague stated. Nevertheless, most Chinese finance is also become major development supporter in Africa, but it is existing a lack of transparency criticized by the Chinese society and the NGOs in China, because the size and the nature of loans is not socialized between the society. So despite the historical Africa-China cooperation and the significant result in terms of gains, China is seen as a risk to the healthy, sustainable, and low carbon development of China. No, because not always the environmental impact assessment is made, even in infrastructure objects. They are not taken in interest the poverty alleviation of the communities in Africa, And the Chinese investment, it is not aligned with the policies of the just transition that state that all this transition to low carbon economy must take into account the interests of the most vulnerable groups in the country, that it must be tied with the health, with the poverty alleviation, with the interest of the communities. There is reported much corruption. The governments are very aligned with the Chinese investors, but because there is corruption in this sense, and there is not taken into account the political orientation of the governments, there are no, except the Taiwan issue, it is no other conditionality from China. But as stated, the majority of Africans are still poor. Only some governmental, some governments are more rich now, but it is not distributed the wealth properly. And the infrastructures in generally are not in benefit of the peoples. They're in benefit of supply to China and to other countries related to China of the natural resources of Africa. So only 12% of Chinese foreign direct investment has been directed to BRI countries. So the most of the Chinese investment, it is not directing to the African developing countries, but it is going to the developed countries as stated. Also, we have investment decisions that are driven by the geopolitical needs instead of financial sense. In this sense, we can say that many African countries are highly indebted now. For example, the Maldives has debt to GDP ratio above 100%. There are huge problems in Burkina Faso and Kenya with this debt repayment. Some countries had to seek refinancing by the International Monetary Fund to repay Chinese loans. So this is making them most dependent in this financial sense, and corruption and bribes are still a problem, but of course not exclusive to Chinese loans, but it is stated also regarding the BRI initiative, and not only in Africa, but also in some Asia countries. And we will end with some recommendations. Internationally, African countries' position should reflect the social, environmental, and economic vulnerability to climate change of the continent. Here, for example, the ocean damage initiative that was approved in Sharm el-Sheikh COP27 of the UNFCCC must be taken into account, and China must be oriented in its investments not only to finance in the infrastructure, but also help in the health area and poverty alleviating area. All this aligned with the just transition that is accepted in the climate action on world level. To integrate climate projection in the elaboration of all sectoral policies, the climate action must have the transversality. It can't be only limited to infrastructure objects, but must imply adaptation, mitigation, and also sustainable development in consonance with the sustainable development goals. For example, some projects that could be mentioned as an example that are combining mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development are the use of the solar stoves in the rural communities, they are not using the burning of woods, of flora, regional flora, and thus they are diminishing the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. They are protecting the health of the women and children that are accompanying the mothers when the cooking is made, and they are protecting the flora of the places, and they are providing most possibilities to sustainability in the rural communities. So this is only one example. There are more, for example, in the wetlands and the mangroves protection by the fishermen communities and so on. Another important thing is take the civil society opinion in the decision-making process, to invite the NGOs, to invite the rural communities, and this is linked also to take into consideration the traditional knowledge. Because many times the traditional knowledge combined with the later technology achievements can give us some outcome to affront the climate change impacts. For example, an irrigation, the irrigation in Peru, Peruvian community, the traditional knowledge for the terrace irrigation combined with the new technologies is permitting now and can be escalated and can be used also in other countries with similar conditions to diminish the use of water, and the water is the principal resource that is by climate change negative impact. It must be protective. This is the first item of adaptation, so as the energy is the first item of mitigation policies. So in all this, also in mitigation, the traditional knowledge must be taken into account. For example, the solar energy that is generated in the some ISOs that cannot be connected to the traditional grids, electricity grids. And also it must be advocated to increase adaptation funding. In first place, loss in damage, because it is permanent loss for the developing countries. And the China financing to Africa is practically in existence in this item. And focus on capacity building that builds local expertise. The developing countries, the African countries, can't be depending on the investment on the country that is realizing the investment, transferring the technology or building the infrastructure to make future use of this infrastructure. It must not be created dependence on foreign expertise. The African countries must have local experts on all the technology used. So that would be all. Thank you for expand my time, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ivanova. Yeah, that was very interesting on the issue of the low carbon infrastructure. Is something that I hadn't quite thought about. I've been reading stuff from The Economist, from the New York Times, and they're very critical about Chinese involvement in Africa. And it's interesting to look at also the French. The French are very critical of Chinese investment, but the interesting thing is that the French didn't help Africa as much as they could have done, right? And they're not actually providing the financing on the financial terms that the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are providing low interest rates for capital investment. So I read, I don't know, 6 months ago that Biden was launching a new initiative for Africa. And the journalist who was writing about it was very critical because he was saying this is still below what the Chinese are doing. The Chinese are providing extremely cheap loans on a long-term basis. But as you say, as you rightly say, it does have, well, you've also said that, it does have some colonialist features, right? Some of that. And it's kind of inevitable, right? And yeah, I found that quite interesting, the points that you were raising. But we're going to start with Dr. Lemi, with Professor Lemi on his presentation, first of all, and then we move on to you. And so you set out to describe the role of Africa in the world. I don't know, it was 16% of population of the world's population is in Africa, and you talked about trade and GDP, and you also described the situation with the trade deficits, and it's not getting any better now with Chinese involvement, right? They're importing lots of things, so everything is constantly moving. We've just heard, and it's something that we haven't mentioned, but for example, Saudi Arabia is striking diplomatic new diplomatic initiatives with China and Iran. Yeah, that's something that we were not expecting, especially because Biden has just been to the continent, and he was saying that he was not going to let go Africa to the Chinese, but we still don't see any teeth from the Biden administration. We had, I remember from Obama, we had high hopes, right? That we thought, because he's from Kenya, or partially from Kenya, we thought that he would have more interest on Africa, but it doesn't seem that was the case. It just seems that every year the Chinese are advancing. And one of my questions that I could put to you, Dr. Lemi, was, to what extent is trade complementary? Otherwise, the African Trade Union, the trade agreement that they've just launched is not going to work. If trade is not complementary, it's going to be very difficult if you're exporting the same products amongst yourselves, right? So that was one question that I could put to you. And then you talked about, the role of the dollar and so on. And something that was quite interesting was what Stiglitz mentioned. He was saying, oh, you should focus on services. To be honest, I'm not quite sure Stiglitz is right. I think he's wrong, because I think Africa should still go back to basics and go back to old-fashioned local manufacturing. So I think they should have industrialization objectives, just like Latin America has been doing. And I don't think the services are a solution for development. I think you can exclude them, but I think you need to go to old-fashioned manufacturing to build your own industries. So I don't know if there are any comments from Dr. Giron or from the others, from Oscar or.
Yes, well, I would like to make a comment. I think that three papers are very related to the next one, because then when I present my paper, I would like to discuss, because just Antonina and I wrote a paper and we presented in the American Economic Association just at the beginning of this year, and we don't agree in some things. So maybe the discussion will be very interesting.
Exactly.
Yes, and well, I think all the data that Professor Adugna has presented us, they are very interesting, and especially the maps. How has China has been arriving to China, and also the conference of Dr. Gázquez has been very interesting, especially in climate change. But well, that field has been very interesting. So I don't know if another person would like to comment, or we'll give the floor to the person.
Thank you for the three presentations. I'd like to ask Dr. Lemi about the role of China towards the African Free Trade Agreement. I mean, which is the role that Africa is playing in particular, like in fostering or not, like this joint, very important agreement in terms of free trade agreement, because probably China has been much more like concerned in fostering their bilateral engagement with most of African countries. But with regards to this like free trade agreement, which is your perception about the role of China with this particular like African project?
Thank you, everyone. That was fascinating. I also have a question for Dr. Lemi. If you could, you mentioned that the free trade agreement didn't include any considerations of climate change, and I'm mostly just curious why that was, and if this is a sort of drawback that the negotiators are aware of, and if there's a process or a thought to include climate considerations and ongoing negotiations for the agreement. And I'm also curious if the signatories are keeping abreast of the changes in, for example, climate change loss and damage funding, and if there's sort of ideas about how to put together those two sort of separate initiatives. Thank you.
Yeah, it's about the idea that probably also José Luis and Antonina are like suggesting, and has to do with if China has not been particularly interested in, or has been basing its interaction with African countries on the non-interference like principle, which is something that has been guiding this particular engagement. There are like some authors that are discussing this concept of post-conditionality. And you mentioned to what extent China is tying its engagement to Chinese suppliers, right? But also, for instance, on the political field, one very interesting thing is to observe to what extent also African countries in voting alignment, for instance, in the Human Rights Council, are always voting, most of them, backing and supporting Chinese like position with certain like human rights situations, or for instance are voting against any condemnation about the treatment that the Chinese do against their minorities. So there is also a subtle way of conditioning that is influencing the alignment of these countries. So I'd like you to reflect on this idea of post-conditionality, because if not, we normally tend to define in a very like simplistic way that Western countries do conditionality and China and other countries do like non-interference. But there is other ways in which this engagement is creating like and is conditioning also the behavior or the alignment of some African countries. I'd like to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
I'm sorry to interrupt. This is more like an announcement because in 10 minutes we have the earthquake drill, and that will be the end of the panel. So we will hear the alert and we will have to get out from the building, and then we come back until 12:45 to to the next panel. Sorry.
We have to stay outside for a while.
Yeah.
11 o'clock?
Yeah. Can I take just 2 minutes to reply to some? Okay, 10 minutes. Okay. I'll try to reply to some of the interesting questions. Thank you, by the way, for the questions. Those are interesting questions. I did not focus that much in China in my presentation, but I work a lot about China and Africa relationship. So let me combine the two questions of Dr. Montalio and Oscar about, is trade complementary for China, plus what's China's feeling about the free trade area, right? If you ask China right now, the trade between Africa and China is complementary, because what's happening is there is oil, mineral going China way, and all commodities coming from China to Africa. For China, it's working. China is fine with that. But from African countries' perspective, I don't think that's complementary. Because, okay, comparative advantage, you have natural resources, you export that. But the concern number one is because nobody knows how many resources are flowing, because China is in control in both technology-wise and how much extended guarantee of access to the resources these countries are giving. And these things are perishable. They are not renewable. So once the resources are done, then you are in trouble. So that's why African countries are saying, wait a minute, why do we only export natural gases, and why do we only export oil and gold and diamonds? Let's create manufacturing sector, as you were mentioning about the going back to the old structural adjustment, structural transformation process. For Africa, they want to go back to manufacturing. They want to replace what China is exporting to African countries. They want to do the t-shirts at home. They want to do the shoes at home. They want to do the pens and pencils at home. That's what is the initiative with the free trade area. Let's expand our capacity of manufacturing. That's the whole idea. Which, my understanding, I did not read anything from China about the view they have on the free trade area. My guess is they oppose, because it's against what they're doing now. It's against their complementary feature of trade. Because if African countries develop their manufacturing base and trade this simple manufacturing thing, then we don't rely on China to buy things. In that sense, China is opposing, but I did not see any statement from China about this agreement. But complementarity, yes, for now, if everybody stays on their comparative advantage, Africa, you have resource, you have natural resource, China have the manufacturing firms, let's trade, that's not sustainable. Second question is about the service sector. I agree with you. I don't know what Joseph Stiglitz was thinking about. Okay, you guys go into service sector, and when they pushed him, what's the service sector? He said tourism, because you have a lot of wild animals here, you have a lot of jungles here, so you can bring people to come to see these places. That's how you make money. Some countries did benefit from that. Kenya is number one. Kenya is the number one beneficiary of the tourism sector, but Kenya invested a lot way before. Like now Ethiopia is trying to compete. Okay, how do you get these people to Ethiopia? What kind of infrastructure? Service sector by itself needs infrastructure. You have some places, exotic places, but there's no roads, there's no hotel. That needs money. So I agree with you. The service sector may not be the best way. One other point why the service sector may not be reliable: how many jobs you create in the service sector vis-a-vis the manufacturing sector? The manufacturing sector, from experience, from Chinese experience, creates huge job opportunities and lifted a lot of people out of poverty. Service sector, you spend billions of dollars building hotels. They don't hire that many people. You can see from this hotel how much money they spend on it. If you spend this much money on one factory, you can create 10 times the people for that. So I agree with you, but for now, because China is dominating the manufacturing, African countries has no choice but to go to the service sector. It's just because of lack of choice. It's not by, I don't think it is by choice. in this interest of time, I'll just go to the last question about the climate consideration, why Africa skipped this. So as many of you know, it's a race to the bottom. African countries want to be competitive. How do you want to be competitive? You don't talk anything about environment. You don't talk anything about labor standard. I remember when Clinton was running for election, NAFTA was a big topic. And this is one video I show my students. And they were pushing him, how about the labor standard? When you go to Mexico, the labor standard is not the same. So our workers may lose job. How does that work? And he promised that, oh, we'll tell them to fix their labor standard. We'll tell them to have leveling ground for competition, for not to lose labor, but that did not happen. African countries are still worried about if they set any standard on the environment, they may lose money. No company want to come. The reason companies want to come is because there is no standard. There's no environmental standard. There's no labor standard. They want to go to the bottom because they can do whatever they want. Right? At this stage, I don't think they want to impose any environment concerns or consideration into the discussion, but hopefully in the future, once they build themselves and they become attractive, they may start thinking about, okay, let's put something in about the environment in the agreement. But right now there is no. I think I'll stop and give the floor. Thank you.
Okay, well, about the manufacturing in the African countries, I agree completely because China is administrating all the manufactured goods to Africa. Even more, the exportation of commodities from Brazil and from Argentina decreased the manufacturing level of these countries that were very industrialized, among the first industrialized countries in Latin America. And now their industrialization level decreased because of this dependence on the commodity trade with China. So I think it's very difficult for Africa to specialize in manufacturing sector. And also we must take into account that if they begin to create the manufacturing sector from zero, their competitive advantage won't be strong. So the affluence of financing resources will be very low at this level. I don't know how they could finance themselves. And the tourism sector could be important if Africa doesn't center on the mass tourism. If there is made more environmental tourism, but taking into account the environment, and here, if Africa sees as other countries that their tourism development is depending on their natural resources, woods, lake, and so on, they could be stimulated to include some environmental norms and their regulating policies. And in second place, in the tourism, they must be taken into account the local communities. For example, in Kenya and Masai Mara and the new natural reserve, the Maasais were banished from the reserve. So instead to have them in the reserve selling some artisans, the tourists like to see national dances and so on, now they are outside the reserve and are performing illegal gaming. So it is bad for the society and for the environment. And then at last, I would like to say something about the post-conditionality. Is it very, very strong from China, not only Taiwan, but in no international fora, including IPCC, including the International Community on Biodiversity, and so on, the UNFCCC on climate, the Chinese countries are in the same group as China.
Hello. Sí, ya estamos. Shall we retake the the whole discussion. So I think we didn't talk enough about the contribution of Dr. Gázquez, and I think he made a few points regarding the issue of adaptation and mitigation. And he talked about an interesting area of conflict between energy justice and climate justice, which is very much in the literature, right? Because the problem with Africa is that it doesn't have at the moment energy justice. In a sense, the per capita consumption of energy, of commercial energy, is very low. But the actual consumption of energy in Africa might not be as low as we might imagine if we take into account sources of biomass, right? So, but anyway, in terms of commercial energy, they don't have justice. There is no energy justice, right? And so I think that was one of the points that Dr. Gázquez made about the sustainable development goals in relation to climate justice and energy justice. And if I can just add one point regarding this, we have a problem because within the Kyoto Agreement, within the climate change debate, wealthy countries are asking Latin America and Africa to contribute to the mitigation of carbon emissions, to the reduction of carbon emissions, right? But as you were saying, I think you mentioned that, Dr. Ivanova, and the fact that they're not responsible for those emissions. Africa and Latin America is not responsible. Yet they're being asked, well, yeah, I mean, Mexico, we could say they are partially responsible, but historically is basically the leading industrial economies, you know, the French, the Japanese, the Americans, the Europeans. They historically, they are the ones who have produced most of the emissions. So they have a greater moral responsibility to mitigate. And it's a bit unfair to ask African countries to mitigate. So you know, that was one area of concern for me. You know, every time people talk about mitigation, of course, we all have to mitigate. We all have to reduce emissions. But I think there is this conflict, and there are different visions. And I think Africa is in a very vulnerable position, and they're not able to mitigate to the same extent, right? Because they don't have the financial means to do it. So that was one area that you mentioned, but I'm just expanding on that point. And you also mentioned the high-speed rail program in Africa, right? And I don't know if you think the high-speed rail program has some negative effects for the local economy or for the regional economy. So I don't know if you could just expand on that, or do you think it's just a resource exploitation project? It's basically not benefiting the local economies and is benefiting the foreign investor.
Well, first of all, I think that maybe Adugna can respond better to that question. These projects, what is evident about these projects is that they are going to be very energy demanding. So if Africa is not allowed to use, as I was saying during my presentation, natural gas as a transitional fuel, they're not going to be able to get those levels of development that would in turn allow them to fight climate change adequately. So I don't know. I just cited these two mega projects. I don't know them in depth. So maybe Adugna can because the high-speed railway is a project of that comes from Agenda 2030, from Sustainable Development Goals. So I don't know what is the role that the African free trade area is going to play in this project in particular. I would also like to try to answer the question Oscar was posing to Dr. Ivanova. We're discussing we're comparing the development regime, the Western development regime, international cooperation to development with the Chinese model. If we were able to speak about post conditionality, I think that I don't know in depth the two development models, but I think that the difference. I was attending a seminar with Padraig Carmody online with the pandemics, and the discussion was around the fact that the Western help, the Western development model, was more based on military coercion than the Chinese one. And I don't know if it's really like that, but in the particular example of the European Union development policy, for example, for fighting against migration coming from Africa, it's very, very present, this military element. I don't know if you remember, but our mentor, the late Mbuyi, who passed away a couple of months ago, I don't know. He was, I don't know if it's still true now with the Ukraine-Russia war going on, but he talked a lot about the Sahel, this region of Africa, of being the most militarized zone of the planet. So why, if this zone gets too much importance in terms of military display in global terms, why it is why it is not known, why it is not more studied, why? And I think it's part of this epistemic predation. No, Africa has been subject to capitalist predation since the 15th century, but it has also been subject to an epistemic predation that pushes African realities and phenomena to the outer limits of theory and policy. So I think I like to work more in this representational domain of what means the display of the aid regime, of the Western aid regime or the Chinese aid regime, and I think that both are not interested in developing or presenting another vision of African societies and local concerns. So that's why I accepted to participate in this panel, because I don't know, Adugna and Hector, they do economics. Dr. Ivanova, I think also, or she's more expert in climate change subjects, but I try to think of how we can relate this specific vulnerability of Africa in these conditions of climate change with this marginalization that takes place in academic circles.
Thank you. Yeah, one last issue was you mentioned the role of mineral assets in Africa, and you were saying there are strategic minerals for manufacturing renewable energy technologies. So I don't know if you can comment on that, or maybe it's
the same story about railway. Yeah, it was like info that I got that helped me to build the argument, but it was like presented in like an opportunity if sustainable development policies were achieved, Africa may play an important role due to its unique concentration of these minerals, but the model should be changed. Blue development, green development, mineral development. I don't totally agree that that's going to be beneficial. I think they should envision another economic system that works for their benefit. I think they should work more on a model, of an economic model that is more sensitive of local realities and that not imposed from any Western or other power.
Well, I would like to comment about the mitigation part you mentioned. Yeah. So you were asking if all the countries must mitigate. Yes, until 2010, it was precisely a Chinese position that the developed countries must respond for their historical contribution to the greenhouse gases emissions at the atmosphere. And they were obligating that the developing countries must not perform mitigation actions. However, in 2014, was launched the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. And in this report was stated that the most vulnerable parts of the earth are the developing countries, including China. The most vulnerability of China was when the glaciers were melting, then inundations were occurring in China, and then droughts. And Chinese population is depending on rice for its diet. So it would be a great, great disaster for China if the climate change was continuing unstopped. So China, after this, was the first country that was promoting the mitigation policies. We can remember also, together with the adaptation, but also the mitigation from all the countries. We can remember that the Kyoto Protocol was determining responsibilities to diminish the emissions of the greenhouse gases only for the developed countries. And we can say that the compromises that the countries got in this Kyoto Protocol was accomplished only by the European countries. Yes? Neither the United States, neither Australia, neither Japan accomplished with these compromises. And this led also to internal controversies between the European countries, because some of the recently involved countries, as from the ex-socialist bloc, they were saying that they also have many problems from development. And if the other countries, the other developing countries are not mitigating, they must not make this too. But they were obliged by the European Union policies. So the Paris Agreement is involving all the countries of the world to mitigate the greenhouse emissions, but it is made by nationally determined contributions. Each country is stating for the Convention on Climate Change how much can they diminish the emissions. It is by the possibilities of their economy, but all the compromises of the developing countries are linked to international help, financial help. So they are stating we can diminish our emissions by this percentage, but for this we must receive for the Green Development Fund or other funds that are used for the climate action, such and such quantity of money. So the historical responsibility is recognized by this financial aid to the developing countries. See, but it is not correct to say that the developing countries must not mitigate. We see that China is developing countries by the United Nations definition, is the first emitter of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it is completely wrong that they must not mitigate. And the other thing that I stated also, they must build the new infrastructure on carbon low basis, because they don't have so much accumulated infrastructure that is highly emitting as the developed countries. So for the developing countries to build the new infrastructure with environmental criteria and climate criteria is much easier with the proper financing, of course. Yeah, and these are the one hand of the mitigation, but the other side is that we have carbon sequestration from the atmosphere, and these are the woods, these are the wetlands, and so on. And the developing countries can contribute to the mitigation by protecting their woods, by protecting their wetlands. Of course, they can make them the sustainable development of these assets for their societies, for their communities, but protecting the woods and the wetlands, it is a very important contribution to greenhouse gases mitigation. And this is stated also in nationally determined contributions for the Convention of the Climate Change. Another thing that must be highlighted, that all the nationally determined contributions, if we make the sum now, are allowing to stop the increase of the temperature to 2 centigrades. The aim of 1.5 centigrades that was launched by the small developing island states is practically very, very hard to achieve. So some countries are revising their nationally determined contributions, also at the light of the financing that is available, to go some closer to 1.5 centigrades. That is.
I just want to add a little bit on the infrastructure railway issue. And I don't know that much about the environmental impact, but I can give you one example in Ethiopia when the Chinese were building railway in the city. So the government is aware of the construction style of the Chinese construction companies. So what they did was they gave the contract to the Chinese company, but on the side, they put a Swedish company as an inspector. So at one point, I remember the inspectors came, looked at the construction, and they said there's something wrong, you have to redo the whole thing. Part of it. So the Chinese agreed to demolish and did part of it again. That's one. But more importantly, what I know about the infrastructure, of course, all African countries want infrastructure. This environment headache is like, okay, what do we do with it? We want the infrastructure, how do you build it? But their major issue, what they look at it is the financial viability of the infrastructure. Can we get money out of this infrastructure? Can you get money out of or a return out of this railway? Some of the examples we know, we're talking during the break, how some of the infrastructures are really not financially viable in terms of generating enough revenue to pay back the loans. Of course, it takes time. You don't get your money the next year or after 2 years. It takes 10, 20 years to get the return. But African countries have other obligations that they have to borrow for almost everything. So the financial viability, putting China and Africa head on, because some of the projects are not generating enough revenue for the countries to pay back the loan on time. So every time there is a request to, can you revise the repayment system? Can you give us some cancellations? Always there is this negotiation. So maybe in the future, they don't have to rush to just build an infrastructure because they want it unless there is a use for it. So one expressway they built in Kenya, the projection of how many cars go on there were way too high than the reality. Not that many cars drive on that railway, on that expressway. So they could not generate enough toll money to pay back the loan. So the financial viability is another headache on top of the environment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just get the feeling that maybe some of those infrastructure programs are somehow subsidized by the Chinese government. They know they cannot recover that investment, but they know there will be other benefits related to that, because probably you have to import their equipment as well, right?
Yeah, part of that is one of the agreement is Chinese government, when they sign the agreement, they say the raw material to build this road or this railway has to come from China.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot get the raw material from China, maybe steel,
Yeah.
maybe some other raw materials. That's one condition. The other condition it slipped my mind right now is that the Chinese put on in terms of generating revenue is they have to show the country after running the system for 1 or 2 years. For example, the railway, they manage it for 2 years. They want to show, okay, it is running now, it is working. After 2 years, you take over, and then you pay back. So the management style of the Chinese and the locals are different. So as soon as the locals take over, the system is not running the same way. Maybe the people are not that expert to run the railway, but for some reason is not generating enough revenue in that sense. Oh, I remember now. When they give loan to infrastructure construction, there is what they call the concessional loan. So that's the subsidy part. The China say, oh, I'll give you a very low interest rate to build this. Even that low interest rate is too high because the revenue coming out of these railways are not enough even to pay that. Yeah, of course it says subsidized. I don't know how much low, but it is subsidized. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if you look at the history of Africa with the French and the Americans, as far as I know, they've offered commercial loans, but very expensive loans for infrastructure, if at all, right? Because they're really behind with, I mean, even the European Union is not really offering favorable infrastructure financing mechanisms, right? So, and then suddenly China turns up and they say, well, look, we'll do it for you. We'll deliver the whole package of infrastructure for you. And you don't have to pay a lot.
Yeah.
And so countries with weak institutions can easily fall into that trap, right? I mean, that's one story. Another story is that there are benefits, even though you have all these problems of huge debt and whatever, maybe there are also some benefits because at least you will have some infrastructure that you didn't have before. And there must be some local benefits. Maybe, the first round effects of the infrastructure will not be so beneficial, but maybe the second round, the third round effects will create some employment. But, we would have to look at the specific case studies of port expansion, port modernization, so, but anyway, yeah, that was my comment. Any other comments? Oscar, yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed Dr. Lemi's presentation, but from what I've heard and from what we're discussing, from my experience, the Europeans have ODAs, and they have done very little, and ODAs ended up more in European hands than anything else. And the US, what it had behind it, policies was security. Now, China, from the work I did for the paper, which said later on, apparently arrives in the country with a package. It doesn't respond to the demand of the state. It goes to the state and says, here I have this project for you. And this is a good idea because we're going to do A, B, and C with this project, which is linked to D, E, and F. And that articulates direct investment with loans. I only looked at direct investment, is what I'm going to present. But when you link it with loans, as I was hearing from Ivanova, I have the impression they are chain, encadenados. And so it's not that the government of country, whatever, has a project and borrows the money for the project. It's more like the Chinese government has an idea, and it's basically at the resources, and it's the money there, and it doesn't care if it uses money, because the point is not in the infrastructure. The point is in what they're getting from.
Yeah, that's an interesting, just that, yeah, exactly. I've read, articles in The Economist about this, Chinese infrastructure financing in Africa. And it's a fascinating area. But I think to some extent the newspaper articles that I've read are a little bit biased, because they're very critical of China. And I think I do agree with some of the points raised in those articles, but I'm a transport economist myself, so we always talk about infrastructure and economic development. And there's always controversy in any country when you have economic growth. Is it going to create local economic development or not? And that also depends on complementary policies and institutions surrounding the investment in infrastructure. So obviously in Africa, like in Latin America, you don't have enough institutional strength. The quality of institution is relatively poor. So you cannot exploit the economies of scale offered by the new infrastructure project. So we can't blame everything on the foreign investor. In other words, you also need to have your own capacity building. You also need to have your own local institutions that know how to benefit from those infrastructures. So, and I think that's on the optimistic side. I think that's one of the challenges of countries that have the new ports that you mentioned in Djibouti and different parts of Africa. But yeah, the latest I heard was that African countries are now, several of them are unable to pay back some of the infrastructure programs in the last 2 years. And so they may lose control of these infrastructure projects, and the foreign investor can take control. But as you were mentioning, the port, there was a port that I think it was in Madagascar. Yeah, I can't remember, or in Sri Lanka. I think there was a famous case in Sri Lanka, which was in a New York Times. I read, and the Sri Lankan government lost control of the port because they couldn't pay back the interest. But
so the Chinese firm kept it.
Military, people are saying that basically it was a military objective, a strategic objective, because they want to have a foothold on that part of Africa. So, so there's more than just, business, basically, as there's geopolitics.
what you said earlier about the China coming with a plan already is partly because there are several examples in African countries. China wants something from that country. For example, Angola, they know there is a lot of oil reserve. So China said, whatever you want me to build, tell me, I'm gonna build it. It's $10 billion worth. So hospital, high school, highway, I'll build. Just give me access to the oil.
Exactly.
So it's for China, it's a win-win. I will dig the oil, I'll give you the infrastructure. I don't care whether the infrastructure is good or bad for you, I'll build it. And that's what China said first when they come to any country. Number one, I'm here for business. Number two, no intervention. You can be a dictator, I don't care. You can be killing your people, I don't care. There are these two conditions. Yeah, of course, there is the Taiwan case. You don't want to mess with Taiwan. As long as you fulfill that, we have a deal, right? So you are right, China comes with this because the other thing is the African governments say they don't have their own proposal. Why don't they show it to China? Okay, I want to build this. Because most of the governments in power, they have only short-term plans because they are not sure how long they stay in power. So they don't want to make, okay, 10 years, we need this highway, it will take 10 years to finish. No, like it's a short-term plan, right? So China said, I'm gonna build this, it will stay for 10 years, it's stay for 20 years. It has to come from China in some cases because the government themselves, they are not sure they want to do it. Like, no, I have other businesses here to benefit my people or my group in a state of thinking. Of course, there is Paul Kagame, which is a different story. He wants to run forever. That's a different story. But yeah, you are right in terms of China writing their proposals.
No, I agree with you, and I think that the corruption in the African governments is very high too. In this sense, they accept what China is proposing, and China wants to have control over the natural resources. This is the main objective, and the infrastructure, the main objective of the portuary infrastructure, for example, is how to transport these natural resources to China or to other countries where China will sell them. So it is complete, you are completely right, but I agree also with Dr. Bonilla, who says that the national governments could have more vision about the development of their own countries. And if already an infrastructure object is accepted, they could see how to link it to the internal development of the country. But the short term of this government, I think it is an impediment to make this. And the other component is that the local societies are not involved in the decision on the national development. The local societies, the people, the NGOs, and so on, they have a very, very low role in Africa. And this is, I think, another impediment for the national development of these countries.
So is there any other questions? Are there any comments? Don't be shy. Yeah, it's very interesting. To be honest, I work on transport infrastructure and economic growth or local economic growth. So that's why I'm interested in this topic, you know. And I think there could be lessons for Africa from India or from Mexico, you know. You could draw some parallels and see what was done in other countries to exploit the economies of scale out of these projects, you know. And but I think that's, if there are no questions, I think, you know, we close it. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you.
To the last session.